Hello there and welcome to the Watchful Citizen. I'm your host for today's show. My name is Josh Cramer and I come to you as a volunteer with the Lancaster County Democrats Public Relations Committee. We have a very special guest with us today. We have Shari Silberstein, who's the Executive Director of Equal Justice USA, located in Washington, D.C. And she happens to be in town doing a strategic planning session with our own local abolition group called Nebraskans Against the Death Penalty. Thanks for joining us, and I hope that this show would give you the opportunity to think critically about the death penalty and some of the issues that surround it. So, Shari, thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you start out by just telling our guests a little bit about how you came to the death penalty issue and why now you're the executive director of one of the most strategic abolition groups in America.
Sure, thanks. Well, I started working on the death penalty about 8 years ago. I was doing social justice work on a variety of issues. I'm actually particularly focused on foreign policy, and I was looking to kind of change the work I was doing and really wanted to get involved in an organization that was more strategic and more effective. And, you know, Washington, D.C. has a lot of nonprofit organizations that just push paper around. And I wanted to be involved in some kind of domestic policy that was not doing that. And so I got involved with Equal Justice USA, and I was really impressed right off the bat with not only the strategy for how to abolish the death penalty, but how to engage citizens at the grassroots level and really, you know, kind of shape policy change through a grassroots approach. And through my experience, you know, with that early on, coming to learn more and more about the death penalty has really opened my eyes to the whole criminal justice system and the way that it's broken.
Shari, what is the mission statement of Equal Justice USA?
Equal Justice USA works to build a criminal justice system that is fair, effective, and humane. And we believe that the criminal justice system has to work for not only be fair to defendants who've potentially committed crimes, but also serve victims of crimes, be an effective law enforcement tool, and serve the public. So we believe that a criminal justice system really needs to serve everybody. And right now, the criminal justice system actually serves none of those communities. So,
So what kind of work do you do, and how big is your staff, and how do you balance, you know, being a relatively small nonprofit with a very large focus?
That's a good question. Well, you know, to answer the last part of your question first, we've kind of focused on the death penalty in particular, even though the criminal justice system as a whole is very broad and could involve lots of different reforms to make it more effective. We see the death penalty as kind of the most visible and egregious part of the criminal justice system's flaws. So we've focused really all of our efforts on working to end the death penalty as a first step towards a broader criminal justice reform agenda. We have about 6 staff people, and we do work state by state because we really believe that change needs to happen at the local level, and that the death penalty is mostly a state policy. It's really at the state level that death sentences are handed down and carried out, and state laws that kind of govern the use of the death penalty for the most part in this country. So we work in about 10 to 12 states sort of intensively, and then we provide broader services to local activists in other states as they need it.
So what are you doing in Nebraska?
We are doing a strategic planning session, as you mentioned, with Nebraskans Against the Death Penalty. And Nebraska really came on our radar screen 2 years ago when the Nebraska state legislature came within one vote of passing a bill that would repeal the death penalty. And we saw that it actually was the same year that there was a lot of momentum in Montana. The Montana State Senate passed a bill to repeal the death penalty. The New Mexico State House passed a bill to repeal the death penalty. The Maryland state legislature came very close within one vote of passing a bill to repeal the death penalty. There was all this momentum happening around the country, and in some states that you wouldn't have necessarily expected, like Nebraska, Montana. And so we saw that as a real opportunity, and we reached out to folks here and said, you know, how can we help? And this was one of the things that people asked us to do.
With those states that are kind of, it seems as though they're on the edge, so to speak, getting close to abolition or closer than they ever have been. Do you see any commonalities, anything that links them together?
I do. I think that what's really changing in the conversation about the death penalty is that it's no longer a black and white issue for people. It's not, do you oppose the death penalty or do you support it? Because when it was that kind of an issue, people were entrenched in their camps and nobody was really moving from one side to the other. Now I think the conversation has evolved to, is the death penalty effective? Can we make it work? And so you're seeing more and more people who, in their hearts, they still support the death penalty and they still believe theoretically that it is a good policy, but in practice it's just been a failure. And so they're coming to support repeal even though they're not saying that they oppose the death penalty. And that shift is really starting to build bridges across all kinds of different communities.
Why do people, let's deal with some of the issues surrounding the death penalty. Even though we've spoke about it a few times here on the show, I think that some of our viewers are probably a little conflicted about this issue. Let's talk about victims' rights, for example. You know, it's a common response that I'll get in the community if I'm speaking out against the death penalty. Somebody will say, well, what about the victims? I mean, what's your response to that?
My response comes from the direct experience of knowing victims' family members who've been through the process. You know, a lot of times when a murder happens, the initial reaction on the part of a victim's family is they want the harshest punishment available because they love their loved one more than anybody else, and it's the worst crime they can imagine to have their own loved one killed. So when they're told that the death penalty is the harshest punishment available, that's what they feel is deserved. What happens 20 years later, after they've been through the process of appeals and reversals and retrials and rehearings, and in the end, most of the time, the sentence actually never is carried out anyway. Eventually, at some point in the process, the sentence is, you know, commuted or retried, and the person ends up getting a life sentence or life without parole. Only it's at the expense of this victim's family member who's waited 10 or 20 years for an execution that never came. And so more and more victims are really finding now that the process is actually more damaging to them and harmful to them, and that they would have been better off if the person had just gotten life without parole in the first place. The sentence would have started the minute they left the courtroom, and then they could focus on their healing process instead of being tied to this court system.